and welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Suzanne Dunford and I'm the Manager of Sustainability and Resilience here at Waverley Council, which I acknowledge is the land of the Gadigal and the Bidjigal, and I pay respects to their elders past, present and future. Many of you registered for this discussion back in March, and we look forward to the wonderful Ocean Lovers Festival, which unfortunately did not take place as planned. Because many things have changed in the past few months as we focused on responding to the global COVID-19 crisis, and our beloved beaches and coastlines were off limits for quite some time. And that's just one local example of how we as a society changed our behaviour to protect the community from a global threat. Tonight, we're going to talk about another global threat to our systems, economy and communities, and that is climate change. And there are similarities in the way society needs to respond to minimise this threat. We need to realise that global threats have local consequences and require coordinated action by government, business and individuals. Oh, hello. Can everyone mute their screens, their cameras, please? We need to share knowledge and take actions to address our vulnerabilities. We need to agree that prevention is better and cheaper than the cure, and governments at all levels need to base their policies and responses on science. So while we address the virus through isolation and distancing, tonight we come together, albeit online, to build our collective understanding about the impact of climate change on our oceans and on our coastlines, how we can work together and collaborate to protect it. And first, some housekeeping. As I said, we'll be muting everyone's mics, but we'll be taking questions online. So we'd love to see your faces. Unless your connection is unstable, then turning off your camera might help. If you have questions, please write them on the chat function, and we'll take some questions after each speaker. There may be some time for questions at the end as well. However, our program is jam-packed, so let's get started. Our first speaker is local resident and esteemed scientist, Peter Cochrane. Peter chairs the board at the Sydney Institute of Marine Science and the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute, and is on the steering committee of the National Environment Sciences Program's Marine Biodiversity Hub. He's also Director of Ecotourism Australia and Earthwatch Australia, and a member of the Council of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, as the Council's global expert on oceans. So he's very well placed to share with us what is happening beneath the surface of the ocean due to climate change and what that means for the biosphere. So I'd like to welcome Peter to take control, start sharing your screen, and off you go.
To our oceans and at a planetary scale. Why are oceans so important to us? Well, most of the water on our planet is in the ocean. The ocean collects, converts and distributes solar energy around our planet. The ocean plays a major role in generating and moderating our climate and weather, and in creating and sustaining the favourable conditions that have enabled life to evolve and thrive on our planet. Rising levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are affecting the planet's energy balance, preventing more of the sun's energy from escaping out to space. The ocean plays a major role in absorbing this extra energy and consequently is warming. The ocean also absorbs about 30% of the additional carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere, and this has implications for ocean chemistry and marine life. Our science is excellent and improving on how the ocean works, on the nature and extent of the impacts that we're having on our planet, and how we might best respond. Needless to say, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the single most important and urgent action we can take. Conservation measures like marine protected areas, fisheries quotas, and restoring degraded habitats work if well planned, well managed, adequately resourced, and sustained. When we ease up on the pressures we place on nature, it responds, as we have seen around the world in recent months as economies have slowed, when fisheries are well managed, and when we stop or slow pollution discharges. We can be rightly proud of the contributions to this work that Australia and Australians are making. We are world leaders in many aspects of marine and atmospheric science and marine conservation, including fisheries management. Now I'm going to go a little bit deeper than those high-level comments to take you through some of the detail. Let's start with the last 800,000 years and then reflect on why we should be worried now about the impact of what we're doing. There are many natural cycles to the planet's incoming solar energy. We are in what the astrobiologists call the Goldilocks zone, close enough to our sun to be not too cold and far enough away to be not too hot for life to develop and survive. However, the Earth's distance from the sun is not constant. We don't move in a circle around it. Our orbit is elliptical with some complexity. There's the annual cycle around the sun, giving us summer and winter, but there are also longer cycles when we are even closer and further away from the sun. And one key cycle here is a relatively stable one of about every 100,000 years that does drive planetary warming and cooling. This data is from Antarctic ice cores and shows the very close relationship between temperature and atmospheric carbon dioxide. During the colder parts of the cycle, glaciers cover most of the Earth's surface, or more of the Earth's surface, than during the warmer periods. And it's important to note that during the warmest period, sea levels have been 4 to 6 meters higher than they are at present. And when the glaciers form and the glacial periods occur, sea levels has been more than 100 meters lower than it is now. So there's an amazing dynamism in how the planet responds to these cycles. And these have driven our planet's climate at this timescale and over which timescale humans have evolved. That is, until the Industrial Revolution, when our human impacts started to move from the purely local scale to the planetary. Let's just quickly look at the planetary energy balance, and don't get too put off by this diagram because most of it's at the top. What comes in mostly goes out. It's pretty finely balanced. About 30% of what comes in is just straight out reflected, and the rest is absorbed by the atmosphere and the surface of the planet. It eventually escapes as heat, but there is a large amount of energy exchange, if you can see my cursor here, between the atmosphere and the surface of both the land and the ocean. The greenhouse gases in the atmosphere act as a blanket, and they trap, hold, and reflect and release this energy, and it's very dynamic and almost in equilibrium. So across the top here is what goes in and what goes out, but there's an energy imbalance which looks small, 0.9 watts per square meter, but over the surface of the entire planet, it adds up to an enormous amount of energy. And because the greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere are rising, this energy imbalance is increasing. So turning to greenhouse gases themselves, it's important to note that there are other greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide and water vapor, and they're commonly put together as CO2 equivalents. And this is the graph shows how they've increased over the last 120 years. And these other gases include methane, nitrous oxide, and synthetic greenhouse gases, such as those used in air conditioners and refrigerators. Now, a year or so ago, there was a media report about carbon dioxide levels reaching 400 parts per million compared to the pre-industrial levels of around 280 to 300. But if you look at the CO2 equivalents, the total impact of this greenhouse gas effect, it's now reached 500 parts per million, nearly double what it was pre-industrial. Human activity, as I'm sure you all know, is responsible for the increase in carbon dioxide and each of these gases over the last century, notably from the extraction and use of oil, gas and coal, from agriculture and land use change. And the loss and degradation of forests, mangroves, peatlands and seagrasses, all of which are major carbon stores, are an important part of all of that change. So increasing atmospheric CO2 means these things. Firstly, the oceans absorb most of this energy imbalance. And if it didn't, the atmosphere would be an awful lot warmer than it is now. This rising heat content means a warmer ocean. Warmer water expands, and much of the observed sea level rise to date is due to thermal expansion of the oceans. The warming ocean is changing ocean current patterns. Along with warmer air temperatures, a warmer ocean increases the melting of polar ice. A warmer ocean also holds less oxygen, and together with factors like increased nutrients, algal blooms occur, and we see more low oxygen zones developing with direct and indirect impacts on marine life. A warming ocean has more hotspots, And rising CO2 levels mean more CO2 is dissolved in the ocean, which makes it more acidic. Looking at some of this in more detail, ocean warming. As you might expect, the surface of the ocean in the light blue here is warming faster and to a greater extent than the deeper ocean. But over the last 60 years or 30 years, this has started to have an impact on the deep ocean below 2 kilometres. We look at this in another slightly different way. At the surface, or the top 2,000 metres of the ocean, there's a very dramatic increase over the annual mean over this period that it seems very, very steady. So the thermal expansion of the ocean, the warming oceans mean sea level rise. This is an average figure for Australia as a whole. You can see a very steady rise beginning from the mid-80s to the early 90s. It's up here. It's often been said to me that sea level rise is all rubbish and doesn't rise at Fort Denison. Well, here's the data for Fort Denison. And noting that Sydney Harbour has unique characteristics, and all big harbours do, and they're unlikely to respond exactly as coasts do, but nonetheless there is a rise also at Fort Denison. Ocean currents, briefly. We have a wonderful diversity of ocean currents that move water and heat around the ocean and our coastlines, and they're driven by the Earth's rotation, the lunar cycle, wind, and differences in temperature and salinity. Warmer water from the tropics moves to the poles where it cools and sinks, and colder, deeper water returns to the tropics. And these currents are also impacted by rising ocean heat content and water temperature, as well as changes to surface winds. Here's one of the major ocean currents, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, showing warm water from the tropics driven into the Atlantic, returned as colder, deeper water to be again warmed in the equatorial zones. There's a recent paper showing that the major wind-driven current systems in the world are shifting both north and south in response to global warming. This next slide shows that. The black arrows show the normal circulation of these currents, and the white arrows show how those currents are being seen to be driven polewards in both hemispheres. These are pretty major effects on our planet. Also, the warming ocean is accelerating the melting of a number of polar glaciers. While it was thought that atmospheric warming was the main culprit in melting of polar ice, recent research has found that warmer waters are also melting at least one of Antarctica's enormous glaciers from underneath. In recent years, researchers have also found that increasing areas of the ocean are becoming oxygen depleted, in part from rising water temperatures, partly because oxygen is less soluble as water warms, but also from nutrients from runoff and river systems that stimulate algal blooms and the uptake of oxygen, which deprives other marine life of oxygen. We have marine heat waves. This is roughly the definition of marine heat waves, when seawater temperatures exceed a threshold for at least 5 days. While most commonly and popularly associated with coral bleaching events, marine heat waves have also had devastating impacts on a number of fisheries, including abalone, lobster and fish stocks, as well as seabirds and kelp communities. And as you might expect, as the ocean warms, there is the forecast increase of frequency and possibly the intensity of marine heat waves, with significant ecological, social and economic consequences. The ocean has absorbed around 30% of the increase in atmospheric CO2, and acidification is becoming a major consequence of this. While this is helpful to take some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere, this is altering the carbon and calcium chemistry of the ocean, with an array of impacts to coral formation, the growth and reproduction of other marine life, including shellfish and many tiny organisms that are the base of the marine food chain. We're at relatively early stages of understanding the extent and consequences of these impacts, but they don't look particularly good. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its first major report on the impacts of climate change on the ocean and polar regions. Here are some of their findings. They conclude that we have set in train major changes in the ocean that are going to continue well past the next century. In summary, The ocean is a very complex beast. We know it a little better. We're changing how it works, and we're beginning to understand what that means, and we are worried. We have unwittingly set our ocean on a new course with some key parameters like atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that are now way outside levels observed over the last 800,000 years and rising. We do have the capacity to change what our future looks like, though. It's in our hands. We must address greenhouse gas emissions and overexploitation of marine life. We need to do better at conserving coastal and marine ecosystems and their functions and restoring degraded habitats. We need to shift from our current consumer culture and linear production mentality that ends with waste. And we will need to face the fact that many people living in low-lying coastal areas around the globe will no longer be able to live how and where they currently do. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Peter. That was daunting, but I think what you've shown us is that there's unprecedented scientific capability in computing and modelling that's giving us a really fantastic insight into what's going on under the surface. Now, I'm not sure if we've got any questions on the chat, but one question I wanted to say is that we hear a lot in the news occasionally about glacier melt, and it does seem very remote, but I was reading just in the news this week that an event, a heat event in Antarctica, actually had a direct impact on a breeding of penguins in Victoria, which has just been discovered. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's a good reflection of how the changes in ocean currents are having impacts at some distance from where one might think the original cause is. This is a global phenomenon. It has local impacts, obviously, but the Bonnie upwelling is a really important part of our coastline, where cold Antarctic water comes up right up against the coast, near the coast of Victoria, and it brings a lot of nutrients and marine life up. And so it's a very productive area, and changes to that have impacts on tiny microorganisms that are at the base of the food chain, all the way up to whales. And so these changes to current systems can have profound effects at some very considerable distance from where you think they might start, i.e. Antarctica. The Antarctic system is a real key driver of our climate, and Australian scientists are really at the forefront of understanding how the Southern Ocean works and its impact on global climate. Thanks,
Peter. We're getting a few comments on the chat, most of them thanking you very much for the presentation. And there's some questions about things that we can do to combat these challenges. And there's also one here about seaweed farms, but I think maybe it's time to go on to our next speaker who'll be able to answer that, and we can come back to some of those questions at the end after we've heard from Blair as well. So if that's all right with everyone, our next speaker is going to talk more about some of what Peter's talked about, but what it means for the marine species and the ecosystems here on the eastern beaches. And she knows a lot about kelp as well. So I'd like to introduce Adriana Verges, who's an associate professor and a marine biologist, a marine ecologist based at UNSW Sydney. Her research focuses on the ecological impacts of climate change on our oceans and how to develop restoration solutions to rewild the coastlines. And she's published more than 60 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, very passionate about communicating science to the wider public, which she's doing tonight for us. Thank you, Adriana, especially through art and films. So don't forget to put your questions down during the presentation, and I'll ask Adriana to start driving the chat now and present some of her slides.
Right, so you should all be seeing my slides now.
Yes, perfect, we are.
So thank you very much for having me be part of this panel. It's a true pleasure, and thank you, Peter, for such a great job of giving an overlook at the physical impacts of climate change. in our oceans. So what I'm going to do now in the next 10 minutes is talk a little bit about what are the impacts of this warming to our local marine ecosystems. And by local, I mean New South Wales, I mean Waverley. And I'm going to briefly mention some restoration solutions. So to do this, I want to first introduce you to one of the most important foundation species of our local marine environment. These are kelp forests. And there is one species called, it's the golden kelp, it's called Eclonia radiata, that is like the biological engine that drives a lot of biodiversity. Southern half of Australia. It's interesting because a single species dominates our reefs along 8,000 kilometers of coastline in the southern half of Australia. Now, these kelp forests are incredibly productive. They are absorbing carbon, they create food and shelter and habitat for hundreds of species. And a lot of those species are actually found nowhere else on Earth. So we call this system that covers the lower half of Australia, the Great Southern Reef. And some of the species that we find here are, for example, the weedy sea dragon or the eastern blue devilfish or the giant cuttlefish. And these species are found nowhere else on the planet. So if these kelp systems disappear, these species also disappear. Now, how are these species impacted by climate change? Well, they're impacted like all other species on Earth. And essentially, when it comes to the response to warming, there's really only three main options. So if an organism experiences warming, one of the options is that it may die, it may respond by dying, and that happens when the physiological limits are surpassed. So this is very much linked to the heat waves and extreme events that Peter was mentioning. Another option is to adapt. You can adapt to the new warmer conditions, or else you can just move. You can move away from the warm place and into a cooler area, which is within your preferred temperature range. And that third option is the one that we see more widely. So worldwide, we're actually talking about climate change having caused a universal redistribution of life on Earth. And this includes land and the oceans. A lot of species are moving to higher altitudes to stay within that preferred temperature range. In the ocean, some species are moving to greater depths, but the vast majority of species are responding by moving towards the poles. Now, species in the ocean are moving particularly fast, and one of the reasons for that is that they are influenced by ocean currents like the East Australian current. Now, this is a current that was made famous in the Disney film Finding Nemo. And essentially what these ocean currents do is they push warm tropical water from tropical places like the Great Barrier Reef and into higher latitudes. And as they do that, it's not only the warm water that comes, it's also the larvae of all these tropical species. And that helps species to expand their distribution towards the pole. So in Nemo, we saw how some tropical species were able to hitch a ride and come down as far down as Sydney in the East Australian current. Now, the reality is not quite like it was depicted in Nemo, but we are actually seeing increasingly more and more tropical species in places like Sydney. These are some examples from social media where people are finding coral trout. This is one of the most prized species in the Great Barrier Reef, thousands of kilometers away. And we're occasionally starting to see it in places like Sydney. And we also have unicorn fish. It was found all the way down to Ulladulla, and it's a very healthy, mature specimen. So these are anecdotal examples, but we also have very clear data from fish surveys that shows an increase in the number of tropical species. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, is that really such a bad thing? I mean, surely, tropical species tend to be colorful and cute. What's the problem? And I guess to show you some of the problems that are associated with this, I want to direct you to a research study that we're doing in Coffs Harbour, near Coffs Harbour in the Solitary Islands Marine Park. And what you're seeing here are some photos from the seafloor that show that in only 10 years, or just over 10 years, we have actually lost our entire kelp forest from certain sites. So places where kelp, this foundation species that provides habitat to all these temperate species, places where it used to be very abundant, have now completely disappeared. And this disappearance is linked to the appearance of new tropical species, including some corals, but also a lot of herbivorous fish, vegetarian fish, that they're normally characteristic of healthy coral reefs, but they're starting to become more abundant in these temperate reefs, and they're overgrazing the kelp. So the kelp is disappearing because it's getting stressed by the warming and because it's getting overgrazed by these new species that are coming in. We're also seeing corals expanding in Sydney. This is a photograph from a place near Manly, where we're seeing colonies of coral that are increasing in size. And this is something that people have been seeing in the last few years, like in the last 10 years at the most. So there's some very remarkable changes happening locally. Now, what happens? What do we lose when the kelp disappears? On the one hand, of course, we're losing the habitat for species that are found nowhere else on Earth, like the ones I was just mentioning earlier. So there's this loss of biodiversity and endemic species. But we're also actually losing our most valuable fisheries. So in Australia, the most valuable fisheries are abalone and rock lobster. And these two species depend on kelp. So when you lose the kelp, you lose these fisheries. And we're seeing these already in places like Tasmania, for example. But we're also losing habitats that are capturing carbon. So because these kelp forests are so productive, they're taking up a lot of CO2 via photosynthesis, and some of this CO2 gets degraded and goes back to the atmosphere, but a lot of it is actually sequestered in deep sea systems, for example. So when we lose the kelp forest, we're actually losing our ability to mitigate this increase in CO2. So how about solutions then? So obviously this is an obvious one. I'm sure I don't need to bang on about this one in this kind of audience, but of course, the number one thing we need to do, reduce CO2 emissions, completely urgent. From a marine ecology and more of a citizen kind of point of view, other things that we can do that are important are protecting and restoring our underwater forests and meadows. And that's something that my research group is doing. These are two restoration projects that we have ongoing. One is called Operation Crayweed. The other one's called Operation Posidonia. Operation Crayweed is about restoring lost underwater forests of crayweed, which is a species that went missing in the 80s because of pollution. And we have found a way to bring it back and reestablish those lost underwater forests. We have sites all over Sydney, but one of our most popular ones is actually in Bondi, in Waverley. So we are kind of reversing local extinction, creating forests that are capturing carbon again, and they're providing habitat for species that couldn't be there before. The other project is Operation Posidonia, and this is about restoring a seagrass. This is particularly important for carbon sequestration because seagrasses can be 20 to 30 times more effective at capturing carbon than terrestrial forests. They also don't get affected by fires. So they're an incredibly important ecosystem, and this species that we're trying to restore is actually now officially classified as an endangered ecological community. It's declining so fast that it is expected to become extinct in the next 15 to 20 years unless we do something about it. So we have a restoration project that at the moment is in Port Stephens, but we are actively seeking funding to bring it over to Sydney. And then the third thing we can do in terms of solutions is to get involved, spread the word. Both Operation Crayweed and Operation Posidonia, we are constantly in need of volunteers. We also take donations, and every dollar that comes in gets used in hands-on restoration. But there's also a project that I wanted to talk about called Red Map, which is about enlisting citizen scientists to document the movement of species because of climate change. So the way you participate is when you see a species that you think, oh my God, this just shouldn't be here, take a photo, upload the photo, it gets ID'd by an expert, and then it gets recorded. And scientists use this data to understand how far a species is moving. And it's incredibly useful. So now, before I finish, I just wanted to highlight that just today, actually, the ABC announced the premiere of a brand new series called Australia's Ocean Odyssey, A Journey Down the East Australian Current. And it's a primetime 3-part documentary series. It's exploring the fascinating kind of things that happen along this very important ocean current. And it features some of the research that I just mentioned about the loss of the kelp and the crayweed restoration. So make sure to tune in, and it starts on Tuesday, 9th of June at 8:30 p.m. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge and mention my many colleagues and collaborators from Operation Crayweed and my climate change research, and thank the funders. And over to you, Sus.
Thanks so much, Adriana. It's really inspiring work that you do, and we're so happy that the project you mentioned here in Waverley has been successful. And I wanted to ask you a question about that, because in the IPC special report on oceans that Peter mentioned, there is a finding that restoration and protection projects that happen informed with local knowledge and community participation, as well as based on science, are proven to have greater success rates. And I just wanted you to comment, that's a great finding to see, like a qualitative finding to see in a scientific report. Why do you think that is?
It's true. It's actually widely recognized that community engagement and participation in restoration enhances the success. I think it's partly, it basically increases people's stewardship about the local marine environment. My own experience with Operation Crayweed is that as more people became involved and interested, there was like an echo effect that led to more funding. It led to philanthropic donations that were very meaningful in certain places. So there's like a positive, it's like a snowball that just keeps getting bigger. But also there's that kind of vigilance. So like, for example, we get messages from people telling us about our crayweed forests in Manly all the time, from swimmers going, hey, I saw that your crayweed is getting grazed by this fish. And like all of that helps us to make the project better. But yeah, so both projects actually involve the local community. It's an essential part of the project. And I think that's part of the success. The other thing with Operation Crayweed is that we've been collaborating with artists to kind of communicate the message beyond what we can express with the science. And this is with Jennifer Terpin and Michaeli Crawford, and that has been a very successful vehicle, you know, communicating the restoration effort through artwork and music and exhibitions that has greatly improved our ability to reach a much bigger public.
Excellent. There's a question that came in just after Peter's presentation, which was asking about whether seaweed farms or increasing seaweed can actually assist to deacidify the oceans. Deacidify. What are your thoughts on that, Adriana?
Yeah,
and maybe
it actually, yes, it can. So because so kelp and seagrasses are so productive, they change the pH of the water and they can deacify it. That's something that happens during the day when photosynthesis is occurring, and at night it doesn't. But yes, it can, at a very local effect, it can actually improve the conditions for, you know, shellfish, for example. So yes, there's something in that, absolutely.
And another one following that theme, there's a question here is, why do sea forests sequester more carbon than terrestrial forests?
So that's just the seagrasses, not the kelp.
Okay.
That's because the seagrasses live in very sheltered embayments where the organic matter accumulates, and it accumulates over, you know, thousands of years, and there's less decomposition. It's just a better environment for sequestration, essentially.
More stable, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we've got another question that you spoke about earlier. Species moving, does that cause other species from the original habitat to move and also become prey or preyed by other new species? So
Yeah.
ecosystems are complex things.
Yeah.
How does that play out?
So that's, yeah, it's a really good question. The problem with the movement of species is that they're not all moving together. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a Great Barrier Reef coming down south? But they're not. Some species move, other don't move, some adapt, some die. And what you get is this new mixtures of species with new interactions. You have a tropical predator encountering a completely novel prey that hasn't developed any defenses. So that's why you get this kind of unexpected kind of results, like the overgrazing of kelp forests by fish. You know, that's something that hasn't happened before. And it's because these fish are moving faster than the kelp is kind of disappearing. So yeah, and it's really hard to predict the impacts of those new interactions.
Wow, it's big. There was a question, you mentioned the corals and the bleaching, and there was a question earlier, I'm not sure if it's Peter or yourself, which was about the impact of coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. Did Peter or Adriana want to talk about the impacts that we're seeing now?
I mean, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. You know, it's about 2/3 of the shallow reefs that have now been impacted by bleaching events that are happening so close together that the system cannot recover. So it's a major impact, and that's Great Barrier Reef, but it's actually happening all over the world as well.
Yeah. There's been a little bit of discussion on the chat about proposed cruise terminal in the eastern beaches, but I guess it's also a question that looks at what we do with coastal infrastructure and how that impacts our coastal and marine ecosystems. I'm not sure what the question is, but do you want to comment on, you know, what can we do to speak up and protect these precious environments and the habitat restoration that we're trying to do while our populations keep growing in coastal areas?
I mean, I think, you know, in a place like Sydney, obviously, you know, there's a lot of us. We have to find ways of coexisting with nature. And I think if we try, it is possible, you know. So I'm amazed at just how the beauty that we see. Like, I went diving last weekend and I saw that with the sea dragon photo I took last weekend, and, you know, and that was in Cornell. So that's exactly the kind of habitat that would be impacted by a new cruise ship terminal, which I think would be a terrible idea, obviously, and not compatible with protecting these coastal marine environments. However, there are other types of constructions and other types of infrastructure that I think are within what we can do in an ecologically sustainable way. You know, so there's, you know, I'm not saying no to any development, but yeah, there's. My understanding is that the cruise ship terminal is currently on hold. So.
They're not very popular cruise ships at the moment. Peter, did you want to speak?
Yeah. And not directly to the cruise ship terminal one, but to the whole question of being much more clever about how we do some of these developments. And again, not necessarily cruise ship ones, but the Sydney Institute of Marine Science has been doing some fantastic work with green engineering. They've got a great project called Living Seawalls. So rather than having just blank concrete walls as seawalls, that you can have biomimicry, creating textured surfaces which organisms can live in. So there are a lot of clever things that we can be doing, and we really need to be both learning the lessons from the past, not repeating them, or repeating the mistakes, but also investing more in more intelligent ways to do some of these things, recognising, as you said, we have some immense pressures to deal with.
That's right. Well, there's a few more questions there, but a lot of them are around, well, what can we do? So I think we might move to our next speaker. Better get your bio up there. So we can have a few more questions at the end. So far we've been looking at we've been looking under the surface at the impacts of climate change in oceans and coasts, which are in some ways invisible to us, even though a lot of us look at the ocean every day. But our next speaker is going to cover how climate change is also impacting financial markets through both biophysical risk, but also investor actions, and open the discussion up a bit more on other opportunities for actions that we can all participate in. So I'm very pleased to introduce local resident Blair Palese. Blair is an advisor to the C40 Cities for Climate Action and a communications advisor to climate risk company XDI. In 2009, she founded 350.org Australia, and she was CEO for 10 years. She's a board member now of 350 and also Green Music Australia, and a mentor in the City of Sydney's Women for Climate program. And previously, she worked at Greenpeace and she was head of PR for the Body Shop International. It's a very busy lady, and very nice to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Suze, and thank you everyone for giving up your time. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see if this works, and hopefully you will be able to see my presentation if all goes well. Let's see. How's that? Can you see it? Great. Thank you for having me. My background, although I have spent a lot of time thinking about climate change, the impacts and the science, I've also worked mostly on developing campaigns on how we can do things to make a difference on climate change. So what you're going to see for me is not technical so much as a little bit of a more general overview for all of us that are out there that care about the issue, but maybe don't know exactly what we can do, just to get you thinking about a few things and to tell you some of the good news stories, as well as some of the worrying aspects, of course, of the impacts we're seeing. Of course, more than ever after the bushfires, Australia is really in the hot seat when it comes to impacts. We have probably experienced more impact from bushfires than any other country for a long, long period of time. So 2.5, 3 months of impacts across the whole of the East Coast, but also if you can remember back, and it wasn't that long ago, that the fires were also happening in South Australia, Kangaroo Island, Western Australia, even up in the Northern Territory. And in some cases in places in rainforests that have never seen the kind of dry heat that occurred to cause fires. So we can, unless we're really digging our head right into the sand, we can't pretend that these impacts aren't happening at a much more quick rate, impactful rate, and a dangerous rate that's having an impact on where we live and how we live. But I'm going to talk a little bit about moving the money, and in particular, how we can do some things that will make a difference to shifting things quickly and moving on to what we can do next to sort of work on how we stop the process, if that's possible, and as quickly as we possibly can. So from a very simple point of view, when I worked at 350, this was my favorite slide because it sums up all the complexity of people saying, I just don't understand climate change, or it's too complicated, or the science is too hard. It's really not that hard. In a nutshell, the 5 points are, it's warming, that's our planet. We're doing it. We're definitely sure that we're doing it and it's happening. It's very bad, as we could see with the fires. But the good news is we have the technology to fix it. So I'll touch a little bit on some of the technology that's going on right now and how fast that speed of change is happening. Peter mentioned the parts per million of CO2. And there's the reason the organization I worked for, 350.org, was called what it is that's the safe number that we need to get back to. We're well over 400, 416 is the CO2, but as Peter mentioned, the CO2 equivalent, the other gases that are involved in impacting the climate are much, much higher. So the news isn't good and we need to get active. This is a kind of a scary slide, and you certainly don't need to know the detail. But just to introduce this idea that I think really changed a lot in the view of how fast climate change is happening and what we needed to do, which was this idea of what our carbon budget is. So what is the budget that we have left if we're going to have a livable planet and stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming? And it's important to note that 1.5 is very high already. We've seen just under to slightly over 1 degree of warming around the world, and we've seen incredible impacts of that. Adriana's talked about the coral bleaching and impact on kelp, etc. We've seen ourselves the impact on the polar regions in the news. Certainly we've seen the fires, and not just here, of course, the Amazon rainforest, California, places again, Siberia, that have not experienced the kind of fires that we're starting to see are really happening. So what's a carbon budget? The carbon budget simplifies down this notion of, well, this is how much we have left to burn before we do our planet in, but it also takes away some of that complication of, well, we have various ways that we use fossil fuels that, you know, throughout our society, whether it's for energy, transportation, etc. If you strip all the detail, the splitting up of that down, the truth is we have to contend with this number. So that gives us a kind of a map or a menu for looking at what we can take out fastest and where we can do it the easiest, and then work back from there to the more difficult things. So this is what people and scientists and experts and economists are starting to use now, or have been over the last 5 years, to think differently about climate and to begin to address it with some real solid ideas about where we can make differences. Energy by far is the #1 thing because it's coming through coal, oil, and gas, 3 very specific things, and we can shift many of them with things like renewable energy. So I just leave you with that idea of the budget, because we all have our own personal carbon budgets as well. The more we can bring down within our own budget, the more we can do personally. But the big question is, how do we move the overall number, that big number of 600 gigatons? And there are loads of fantastic plans that have been put out. And there's something called Project Drawdown. If you haven't heard of that or seen it, look it up, Google it up. It's a very specific map for how to draw down that 600 gigaton, you know, within that budget that we have. And what are the most effective ways we can do that? So if you're interested in where the good news solutions are, look up Project Drawdown and have a dive into the map and the information that's been provided about how we do it. We have the technology. So most of us know that solar and wind are already everywhere in use around the world. But what you might not know is just how incredibly fast the change has happened. They're now cheaper than existing fossil fuel, which you wouldn't really have believed even 2 or 3 years ago. So it's been that they're cheaper, of course, to build as new projects. But at the moment, solar wind energy is now cheaper than where we've already built, for instance, a coal-fired power plant. So this shifts everything enormously, but we have to make that shift happen very, very quickly. The challenge, of course, is ownership. So coal, oil, and gas companies want to hang on and make as much money as they can. So the real questions we have to ask them is, what's your transition plan? Because if you're not transitioning, you simply mean that you have accepted the idea that you're not interested in saving the planet. That is a criminal idea that as a company, you think that making money is more important than an existing planet where we can all thrive. So how do we change those things? I'm going to, in a minute, talk about how we can use our own power as consumers and investors to make a difference. But, you know, the really, I think, for me anyway, when I get slightly concerned, worried, sad about the impacts of climate change, we look at some of the things like battery storage coming online so quickly that within about 2 to 3 years, it's changed everything to do with energy. And South Australia has been an incredible leader in showing that it can be done. Took a big risk in doing it without federal government support and dove in, making a choice between rebuilding old infrastructure using fossil fuels and saying that just doesn't make sense, even though it's seemingly new technology. Let's do it. And they developed at the time the world's biggest solar battery storage system. It's up, it's running, it's been enormously successful, and it's driven down costs not only for businesses but for consumers. It's also provided huge resilience in South Australia and to the grid nationally when things happen to our energy grid, whether it's fires or extreme weather. They've been able to feed power into the system in a way that's been incredibly effective. So the big question, I guess, for all of us is, can we move fast enough? You know, that's kind of where we are sitting on the edge of a choice as a human race. Do we decide to take the risks to make the change? You know, figure out how to transition jobs, help companies and or force them to make the changes, because we simply can't continue on as business as usual. So in these corona times, you might have seen quite a few really fantastic articles and thinkers dropping in this idea that we can hit both things at the same time, because unlike anything in probably my lifetime, we're seeing stimulus money being put, taxpayer money, to help save our economy. We can make a choice about that going to transition and green solutions. And it's our job as people in electorates to hold our politicians responsible to that and to say, do not give that money to coal, oil, and gas. We are not going to save those sectors. That is money, strictly speaking, you're flushing it away. So the choice for us is to say to them, We can't do it that way. We have to do it differently. Resilience in the time of an epidemic also means the resilience of our planet. These two things are integrally linked, and we can make that choice and hit both at the same time. So how's money moving? You know, I started a divestment campaign while I was at 350 with a team and quite a few other organizations, and it's phenomenal how successful it's been. And it's been successful in a way that would have surprised all of us when we started about 8 years ago. US 14 trillion divested from coal, oil, or gas. Now, really hard to judge that 14 trillion. Can you pin down every dollar? Of course not. But this is money that's been committed by various institutions. And, you know, it just sent such a strong market message that the time was up for coal, oil, and gas, that things then snowballed and started to happen even more quickly. An example, just today, the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, which was a leader in that early divestment period out of coal specifically, it's the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. And ironically, they made all their money off of oil. And they have, by using this enormous power they have as investors and sending market signals that first coal was no longer acceptable, now very quickly moving out of oil and gas, it shapes the thinking about investment, and others follow suit very quickly. So interestingly, today the news came that one of our own, AGL Energy, has been rejected, will no longer be an investment option. BHP has been put on notice, and Glencore as well. These are companies that are Australian relevant companies, and they're being told that the Norwegian Sovereign Fund is looking quite seriously at pulling their money because their emissions are not dropping fast enough for them. They're not convinced they're addressing climate change fast enough. Here in our own country, Combank, NAB, and Westpac are all three banks that have committed to getting out of coal rather quickly. Not quickly enough, of course, but really the important factor for them is sending that market signal that once we say we're out, things start to change very quickly. Whether they are out sooner than their committed time frame or not, it sends a very strong message that companies that are pure play investment in fossil fuels are going to be at risk. Similarly, the aspect of insurance, really important, because if insurers didn't insure new fossil fuel projects, they simply wouldn't get up. So Suncorp, QBE, and IAG out of coal over the next 15 years, again, sends a really strong message. There won't be new coal projects after those 15 years. It may well happen much, much sooner. I just note something that also just happened a couple of weeks ago, Woodside and Rio Tinto, and recently Barclays, and today there was a new announcement with another major corporate, I'll remember the company in a minute, where shareholder activists, and I don't mean Greenpeace and 350.org activists, I mean investors that actually are thinking about protecting their investment as well as being concerned about things like climate change, take control as shareholders and say to the companies, sorry, your time's up. We don't trust that you're going to act on climate change because you've had a good deal of time to do it. And we're going to vote on a resolution that says, we expect by the next meeting, you will make a change and report on how you're going to change. And this just happened at the AGM at Woodside, where more than 50% of investors for the first time, it's one of the largest shareholder actions that I've ever heard of, said, that's it on climate change. We expect you to report and act on emissions reductions, not just of your primary emissions, but also the customers using your product. So what this means for people that just are running, in this case, gas, for instance, if you don't have a transition plan, you're simply not reacting to what we're telling you. So the shareholders basically said to these companies, you will show us by the next meeting how you're going to transition out of your core business. Now that's a major shift that you wouldn't have expected even 5 or 10 years ago. So those are some good news things. They're technical, but it means that money is moving quickly and consumers have played a really big part in that. So what you can do, if you haven't done it already, we're going to put a poll up. Suze, and Nick, do you want to put the poll up? We're going to ask you if you've done any of these things yet, just to get an idea of the numbers of the people on our call. So if you wouldn't mind taking the poll to see if you've done these things, and while you're doing it, then we'll look at the numbers and see if people have done them. I think for a lot of people, there's a thinking that this is hard to do, moving your money. And I think many find that once they start a process of doing it, it actually becomes fairly easy to do, or it becomes easier as you find your way through. It's also important to say that you wouldn't be the first. Divestment campaigns have been going on now for 8 to 10 years. A lot of people have moved their money. So you'll find that the people that have gone before have kind of ironed out some of the ways for you to do it. and that there are companies offering alternatives to you. So if you would take the poll, we'll put it through and we'll get some numbers. And I think, you know, it's worth mentioning renewable energy. Have you picked green power out of an electricity retailer or purchased green power? And or more importantly, a big step is installing it in your home. Really good stuff to do, but sometimes a little hard, particularly if you're in an apartment. But if you want to vote for that, we can see what the results are. Do you want to look at those now, Suze, or do you want to wait until the end of this section? You can do it either way. Oh, there we go. So that's fantastic, 55%. And I would tell you that Superfund divestment is the one that probably most people say, oh, it's just too hard. I don't even know where to begin. But the likes of an organization like Market Forces that actually has a super switch website that we over 350 originally did with them together, gives you everything you need to make your way through the step process to make the change. Banks, you know, you've just seen that Westpac, NAB, and Combank have stepped out of coal. But if you don't think that's enough, take a look at banks like Bank Australia, who are 100% fossil free, and super funds like Future Super and Australian Ethical that have now no investment in fossil fuels. So if you want to make a difference, it seems hard when you kick off, but once you've done it, you're having a big impact. So I can't say enough about how important moving your own money is. And sending that message. Don't do it quietly. Tell them why you're going, ask a lot of questions. And if they don't give you the answer you like, then it's time to move on. So the next, I just want to mention other investments. So some people are also fortunate enough to have the cash to invest elsewhere. Right now, there's a real burgeoning of places to invest in things like renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, and after the fires, that one's really particularly important, and innovation in things like clean tech. And there's even a new area called ClimTech, climate technology. So the company I would do some work for called Climate Risk and XDI just use big data to try and help councils, cities, states, and companies to figure out where their biggest climate risk is due to impacts and how to protect against whatever is going to hit their infrastructure the hardest. So this is a whole new area, and there are companies like this all needing support and investment. You can join a local group, and there are lots of them around in Sydney that are doing terrific work. Hearing Adriana's volunteer science stuff is really great, and that's taking off around the world. You can also join a local group, and it really depends a little bit on what catches your interest. So whether it's moving the money side or protesting against a particular project like the Stop Adani campaign, joining student activists on Fridays to send a really strong message for federal leadership or whatever. You know, that Second Nature is another organization that's up here that I think Suze will talk about at the end of our presentation. Running for office, tricky one, right? Everyone thinks, no way, I'm not up for it. But lots of good local action is happening. And if you can put your hand up for something like that, it can make a major difference. You might only do it for a year or 2 years, but you can have a real impact. And I think one of our biggest problems is that people like us that are on this webinar that clearly care about the issue, because I've just seen how many of you have taken action to move your Superfund. Step up. We can radically change government in any country, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, the US, desperately in need of a government change. You know, it's going to take us getting our hands dirty. We need to roll our sleeves up and get involved. And sometimes there are people out there who are really quite good at this, involved in their communities, have good networks, and could step up. So think about it. Don't reject it out of hand. Taking action at home, we're going to talk a little bit about that shortly, but we all know we can get more efficiency happening in our own energy use. We can choose green power or install renewables. We can do things to reduce waste. We can compost. We can run our own gardens. All those things we've heard about for decades. So they're nice things to do. They're great things to feel good about doing in your own community, but they have a real impact. Peter, do you want to just have a mention of low carbon living? Because I think you probably know it best before we finish up and take some questions.
Sure, thanks, Blair. So this is a tool that has been developed out of the Cooperative Research Centre for Low Carbon Living and a small non-government organisation that I chair in the Blue Mountains. And it's on the web. It's a tool for essentially calculating your carbon footprint and then helping you develop an action plan about how to reduce that footprint. And it looks at your carbon energy use, your water use and waste, and it will give you some great ideas on how to reduce your footprint. And it's free. So the web address is there. There's an email address if you want more information, but have a look. It's incredibly easy to use.
Fantastic, thank you. I just wrap up with that lovely photo of how we launched 350 on the steps of the Upper House with 1,500 people. That's the number we need to get back to. I've noted I do some writing for something called Climate and Capital. And I just want to mention that I think the Waverley Council team are going to share a bunch of links that we've all contributed to. So if you want some more information, Climate and Capital is a new outlet trying to help normal people understand the kind of money side. But things like Renew Economy, one of my favorite sources for being inspired by how fast the speed of change is happening. And some of the fantastic organizations out there like Greenpeace, ACF, 350.org, their Twitter streams, their Facebook pages, their websites filled with fantastic information about what you can do, but also what's happening, how fast that change is happening and where you can plug into it. So thank you very much and look forward to hearing more from everybody and taking questions.
Thanks, Blair. Apologies, everyone. We have gone a little bit over time now. We were a bit slow to start, but again, thanks for joining us today, and we'll try and answer some of the questions that have been coming through. There have been a couple of questions about, are there really too many people on the planet, given the impacts that we're creating and given the amount of energy that we need to keep us going? So who in the panel would like to?
I can do that one quickly if you like. Yes, there are too many people on the planet, but it's not an easy one to fix. And it's also complicated by a whole range of serious issues that the biggest use of energy and materials is not the developing country with the largest growth in populations, but people like us, where often our population is level or falling. So it's not just a question of too many people, it's a question of resource use. And I just put to you on the happy side of the solution to this problem. When we educate girls and women, this problem solves itself so dramatically fast because by and large, most women don't want to have 15 children. So if you're able to educate them and allow them other opportunities, what every bit of research shows is population goes down quite quickly and it becomes a more level playing field. So it isn't necessarily, it's a hard one to campaign on, but those that do campaigning on it find education is the answer, and that educating girls and women in particular works best. So that's somewhat underway, but certainly in many countries we need to do a great deal more of it. But here in Australia, I'd mention cutting aid is one of the biggest mistakes we can make. If we want to really have an impact that helps us as well, continuing to fund aid in developing countries around education is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Blair. There was another question that came in earlier, Peter, you might like to address, which was, is water vapour a carbon equivalent that we need to try to minimise?
Oh, yeah. Water vapour is a complicated one. Water vapour is great for all sorts of reasons, weather, and clouds also reflect some of that solar radiation. They also hold heat in the atmosphere. So I have to say, in terms of atmospheric chemistry and physics, we're still understanding how water vapour really plays, well, we understand how it plays a role. What you do about it is another question. One actually interesting example which hit the news a week or so ago that the Sydney Institute of Marine Science is involved in is called cloud brightening, where they've been using a sort of very large fan to send salt water, droplets, very fine droplets of salt water into the atmosphere above parts of the Great Barrier Reef to form clouds to actually cool water. And the initial results from that, which were reported just recently, look quite promising. Now, I'm not suggesting that engineering on that scale is a great idea, but it shows that we might be able to use water vapour and encouraging cloud formation over some of these hot spots to reduce their impact. But as a whole, it's a very complicated story, water vapour. Yeah. I'm not going to pretend to buy into it anymore.
Thanks, Peter. I think there is a bit of misinformation that goes out there by some of the skeptics around the role that it plays. Look, there was a lot of talk on the chat, and it sort of went off on a life of its own about incinerators and waste issues. So I think we have gone a fair bit over time. So I think we might bring the session to a close because it is now 7:40. Look, there are a lot of ideas in there of things that you could do. Everyone should get onto RedMap and help out the citizen science efforts that Adriana pointed out. Everyone should keep informing themselves of the science that's available through some of the organisations and some of the links that Peter's going to send around. And Blair's given us some really inspiring and somewhat challenging a challenge to really get involved ourselves. So please stay in touch with us via Second Nature. I encourage you to sign up if you haven't already, but at least visit our events page for other talks like this one. We'll also send out a short survey after the presentation. It won't be long, about 5 minutes, to get your feedback and tell us what else you want to know about. And we'll include those links that Blair mentioned that we've got from the speakers. Don't forget to tune in on the 9th of June for the beautiful docuseries that the ABC are putting together on the oceans to learn more about what we were talking about tonight. And as Peter said early on, conservation and restoration measures for our marine and coastal environments can work. It's about us making room and giving nature a chance to recover. So we're going to sign off tonight with a short video, and it goes to one of the questions I think, Chris, you asked in the chat about, is COVID good for nature? Well, there's been some video, you might have seen it, and it shows some wild animals reclaiming urban and coastal spaces during recent global lockdowns. So I'll just see if I can play that from YouTube for you. But thank you again, especially to our speakers. It's been a really informative evening and discussion, and these guys are global. So thank you guys for joining us, Peter and Blair and Adriana. We're so grateful you could come and talk to our community tonight. And thank you all for giving up your evening to come and listen and educate yourselves and link up with other people. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've just got to share my screen. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Suze.
you.
Thanks so much.
Good night, Sue.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
See ya.